The Pirate Queen, Queen Elizabeth I, Her Pirate Adventurers, and the Dawn of Empire, by Susan Ronald. Narrated by Josephine Bailey. Copyright 2007 by Susan Ronald. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Susan Ronald and Alexander Hoyt Associates, and was produced in the year 2007 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Author's Note: for those readers looking for a bodice ripper about Elizabeth's loves, I fear I would disappoint you in The Pirate Queen. But if, on the other hand, you always wanted to know more about Elizabeth as a person and a monarch, then please read on. Since I was a young child, I have been fascinated by Elizabeth Tudor beyond her putative love affairs, and especially how this phenomenal woman had been able to rule with an iron fist in an age of pure male domination. She was the first female ruler of England to rule in her own right. However one speculates about her real reasons, she was determined to remain her own mistress and thereby guarantee England its independence from foreign domination. I especially wanted to know how she was able to achieve this so successfully. The Pirate Queen, in part, provided me, and hopefully will provide you, with many of the answers. She had the quick intellect of her mother, her father's boldness, and both of their bad tempers. She was hugely vain and courageous, highly educated and gifted, monumentally abused in her youth and shunned by family, church, and society. She at times played her advisers and courtiers consciously off against one another, and more often than not she listened to the sage counsels of William Cecil, Lord Burghley, above all others. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, remained the love of her life, and as such it is immaterial if that love was consummated. In the Queen's mind she was a virgin, married to the country, and intent on keeping England independent of foreign princes, come what may. Elizabeth was all these things, and many more. In her time the English Renaissance took root and flourished, spawning the great talents of Sidney, Gascoigne, Spencer, Kidd, Marlowe, and killing 3 of the 5 in service of the realm prematurely. Great poets like Raleigh, the embodiment of courtly love and adventuring, as well as Dyer, a gentleman adventurer too, help us glimpse behind the curtain of time into Elizabeth's court. Chettle, Nash, Lodge, and of course the remarkable Shakespeare, all found their voice in Elizabeth's England. But why was this so? The reasons are far too varied to do justice to here, other than to say that the writers themselves reflected the times. Ordinary people went to the theatre to learn about history or England's friends and foes. It was a time of tremendous change, and the Queen herself wanted to engage her people, on her side naturally, in the process. That engagement process was a double-edged sword, making and breaking the lives of her most gifted early writers. It also transformed English from a language spoken by very few on the fringes of Europe into the ever-changing, ever-growing world lingua franca that it is today. In the cauldron brewing between Protestant and Catholic, courtier and adventurer, Spain and the Papacy, Ireland and Scotland, the Dutch and their Spanish overlords, Elizabeth remained constant, imperious, and imperial. She dominated all she surveyed through cunning, wit, loyalty, charm, bad temper, an aura of extreme wealth, and parsimony. It was her parsimony that aggravated her courtiers and counsellors to distraction, making her seem weak and indecisive. She was famous for giving her answer answerless, and wearing her opponents down with her rhetorical arguments. Yet in the end she became the embodiment of the English psyche, and kept the country independent from the Catholic threats posed by Spain and the Papacy. She survived more than 20 assassination attempts, and with her England survived too. She was, above all, an incredibly astute businesswoman as head of state. She feared marriage for myriad reasons, and knew instinctively that by naming an heir she would sow the seeds of her own destruction. For 44 years she successfully evaded this fundamental issue at the heart of her reign. Nonetheless, she was no empire builder. In the simplest terms, if she had been, then she would have wanted a family to keep the Tudor dynasty alive. But her aversion to empire wouldn't prevent her gentlemen adventurers from embracing the concept. All English foreign interests were, at the outset of Elizabeth's reign, either financial or defensive. Antwerp was the main export and money market since the fall of Calais to the French a year before she came to power. With the growth of Protestantism in the Low Countries, Antwerp's stranglehold on northern trade came under threat, and England needed to look elsewhere for foreign trade or perish. The mid-1550s saw the first English forays into faraway commercial entente with Russia through the formation of the Muscovy Company, in the hope that it would lead to a northerly route to Cathay, China, and direct trade with the Far East. When this failed to materialize, other routes, not already claimed by the Portuguese or Spanish empires, were sought. When both great world empires resisted English interloping, viewed by the English as attempts at commercial trade, the age of English maritime expansion, or merchant and gentleman adventuring on a large scale, was born. It is the relationship between Elizabeth and this disparate breed of men, and how they worked together for what was believed to be the common weal, the enrichment of England and themselves, that is the primary focus of the Pirate Queen. Still, to better understand that focus, it is also vital to understand how weak England was when the 25-year-old Elizabeth became Queen. Defence of the realm, and the Queen, was the greatest worry on everyone's mind. Throughout her personal writing, the single-minded attention she gives to security is quite heartbreaking. And the central theme of security remains the golden thread woven through the intricate fabric of her reign. Security for herself before she came to power, supplanted by security for the realm thereafter. In her mind, to create a secure realm, she needed two things: peace and money. When peace was gained at home through deft footwork by the Queen and her advisers within the first year of Elizabeth's reign, the disappointed French, under the mother of Mary Queen of Scots, who had tried to invade England, found themselves ousted instead from Scotland. It was through Elizabeth's gentlemen adventurers that the attempt was foiled, and through her merchant adventurers that money was raised to protect the realm and pay for England's soldiers. In those days, plunder was how soldiers and mariners believed they were paid for the risks they took, and it remained common military policy until World War II to turn a blind eye to the practice. It was precisely these two groups of adventurers who would eventually deliver the security for the realm that both the Queen and the country craved. They would, inadvertently mind you, transform England into the nascent modern economy and empire that would dominate the world by the end of the 18th century. Had Philip II of Spain allowed the English to trade freely in his American dominions and beyond, it is entirely possible that the British Empire would have been quite different. I have a passion for original sources, and before beginning any research in earnest, go through original manuscripts to get a better feel for the individuals I will be writing about. In Elizabeth's case, I was blessed with a wealth of material. Gentlemen adventurers like Sir Francis Walsingham, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake provided me with a rich vein to tap into. Merchant adventurers like Sir Thomas Gresham, William Cecil, Lord Burghley, and his second son, Sir Robert Cecil, wrote nearly every day during their tenures in office. Only some of those original manuscripts are detailed in the selected bibliography, along with other primary and secondary sources. Before beginning to read on, there are a number of points that I feel need clarification at the outset. The first relates to dates. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar that we use today. In October 1582, all Catholic countries moved their dates forward by 10 days, which is sometimes termed New Style by authors, with the Julian calendar dates termed Old Style. By 1587, most of Europe used the Gregorian calendar. England, however, refused, and did not adopt this calendar until 1751. This meant that when it was March the 11th in England, and the first day of spring, the date in France was March the 21st. In addition, New Year's Day was on March the 25th in England. The reasons for England's stubbornness on this matter will become apparent in the course of the book. Since my references are for the most part English, I have converted any New Style dates to Old Style for ease of understanding. Also, I have made New Year's Day January the 1st instead of March the 25th for the same reason. Place names were also different from time to time, and after the first usage of those names I have put the modern equivalent in square brackets. Thereafter I use the original name, which has been introduced previously. In quotations, I have also provided modern meanings for obscure words where I felt the reader would have difficulty, in brackets next to the offending word. These definitions have, by and large, been provided by the Oxford English Dictionary entry for that word. spellings have also been modernized into American English, except where they appear in direct quotations from the period. I have, where appropriate, inserted modern British English spellings in these quotations. Rates of exchange between currencies are derived from a number of sources, ranging from the calendar of state papers to merchant certifications to the Bank of England. Thanks to the Bank of England, I have been able to provide you with a good estimate of what, say, £1,000 in 1599, for example, would be worth today. It's £129,890, by the way. I must stress, however, that these modern conversion rates are approximate only and are primarily based on the retail price indices available at the time, again through the Bank of England. Since conversion rates in modern times fluctuate more rapidly than in Elizabeth's era, it's important to remember that a glut or shortage of commodities, gold in particular, in a commercial market would have a greater effect on currencies than, say, what a loaf of bread, a local product, might cost. When I began writing, the US dollar was struggling to keep below $2 to the pound sterling. By the time I finished the book, the dollar rate had improved to $1.75 to the pound, though still fluctuating. The prognosis from the Bank of England, UBS, CFSB and Barclays for the coming year is that the dollar to sterling exchange rate has been $1.65 to the pound, but the dollar rally would be short-lived. To hedge my bets, I've used $1.85 to the pound in my conversions, mainly because I believe that this is the dollar's natural level for the next year. Again, the conversion rates to today's currencies are not exact and are merely intended to be a representative modern equivalent in dollars and sterling in an effort to aid the reader's understanding. In an attempt to add clarity for the non-British reader, I have also tried to treat elevations to various aristocratic titles uniformly. Once an individual receives a title, I wrote out his full name, for example, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, and thereafter referred to him as Leicester. This is the way it is normally handled in the United Kingdom. Similarly, since there was a plethora of Marys during Elizabeth's reign, I have usually tried to adopt their titles as soon as possible so that they could be more readily differentiated. There are two terms that are used repeatedly throughout the book: merchants' adventurers, capitalized, and merchant adventurers. On the former, whenever the words merchants' adventurers appear, it is intended to signify the company of merchants' adventurers, or their members. Whenever the term is not capitalized, it means investors or merchants who are traders. Whichever one it is intended to be will be clear in the sentence. Pirate is a word at the heart of the book. The word privateer was not coined until the 18th century, and I had a terrible objection to using a word that had not as yet been invented, and then to describe someone with that word used for the first time 200 years into the future. In the 1560s and 1570s, the words pirate, corsair and rover are used interchangeably for the Queen's illegal traders. An interloper was specifically someone who traded illegally in a foreign country, either against English interests or foreign ones. These tended not to be pirates at all. When a pirate raided shipping with the Queen's or another ruler's approval, they are described as holding letters of reprisal or letters of marque. As Elizabeth's pirates, for that's what many of them were essentially, evolved into her adventurers, the word pirate is filtered out. An adventurer in Elizabeth's time was anyone who was prepared to take a risk, from the financial entrepreneurs we would recognize today, to an illegal trader, interloper, to a merchant trying his luck, or an out-and-out pirate. Above all, I hope I have lifted the veil on Elizabeth as a leader, her methods of dominating her men. Why, her famed use of a woman's prerogative to change her mind was in most instances a tactical political weapon, astutely wielded to wrong-foot the opposition. And why state-sponsored piracy and plunder was the only way England could survive. Finally, while I have endeavoured to be accurate at all times, if there are any errors, I must assure the reader that they are entirely my own. Susan Ronald, Oxford, 2006. Introduction. Bilbao, Spain, 6 p.m., Wednesday, May 26, 1585. Master Foster gazed upon Bilbao harbour, feasting his eyes on the fine sight of so many Londoners that had heeded the King of Spain's call for help. Philip II had invited English merchants to send cargoes of corn, and assured the Queen's Majesty that her people would have his very own assurance of safe conduct in these troubled times. Payment for the corn would be made by bills of exchange payable to the City of London in Antwerp at fair market prices, and so the Primrose, a 150-ton Londoner, had been stocked with nearly 20 tons of corn and several ells of broadcloth, and set sail for Bilbao in Biscay. Master Foster had heard that the country was starving, that the whole of Iberia had had a harsh winter, though the master of the Primrose and his men could be no firm judges of that fact for themselves. Bilbao had been bathed in warm sunshine the past 2 days in port, and the Spaniards they had seen appeared to have been well fed. Indeed, as Foster took in the near idyllic scene, with the sun low in the sky, its rays reflecting lazily on the bay, Bilbao seemed a welcoming voice on the wind, as she had always been. It was then that he noted the soft groan of his rigging. A fine southwesterly was stirring. Foster prayed it would still be blowing the following day when they would weigh anchor and head for home. He hunched over the rail of his ship, leaning heavily on his arms, and looked on as a number of sleek Spanish pinnaces darted between his fellow Londoners. It was one of those rare moments of leisure for the captain of an English merchantman. Perhaps that is why he did not spy the pinnace heading for the Primrose. When the watch called out the approach of the Spanish vessel, and that there were 7 souls aboard, Foster awoke from his reverie and barked his orders to the crew, alerting them that a small party wished to board. What the devil could they want at this time of the evening? The Primrose's cargoes had been unladen. It was most unusual for the Spanish merchants to settle their bills of exchange at this hour of the day. Further, the master of the Primrose had already settled the matter of loading the Spanish wines for the return voyage the following day. It was a wary Foster who greeted the corregidor, magistrate of Biscay. The hale and hearty fellow presented Foster to the 6 other men as Biscayan merchants, and claimed that they wished to give him a small token of their esteem. They had brought a hamper full of fresh cherries as a gift, a favourite of the English Queen, or so they had understood. Master Foster thanked them, and ordered that beef, biscuit, and beer be brought to the impromptu gathering in his cabin. Yet before they sat down to eat, 4 of the Biscayan merchants made their excuses and announced their intention to return to shore aboard the Spanish pinnace. This lack of common civility made Foster truly smell danger. He ordered his first mate to accompany the Spaniards back on deck, simultaneously giving him the signal that all was not as it should be. It was a well-rehearsed exercise for English merchantmen in foreign waters, and the first mate knew how to alert the crew in secret to be ready for an assault. The master of the Primrose returned to his unwanted guests, laughing and joking with them in broken Spanish and English, noting all the while through the porthole the pinks and oranges of the setting sun, wondering undoubtedly if it would be his last sunset. After some 15 minutes, the watch called out again that the pinnace had returned, carrying more than 20 men, and that a larger vessel with perhaps as many as 70 merchants also followed. Foster silently prayed that God would be English this day. The master bade the corregidor and his men to return to deck to greet the ships, expecting the worst. They were, after all, only 26 men against some 90 or more Spaniards. He could only imagine that these Biscayan merchants meant to board the Primrose, capture the crew, and at best imprison them all. Many a merchantman had been imprisoned before them, and most had fallen foul of the Inquisition. It was a destiny that he could not wish upon his enemies. Once above deck, Foster's suspicions were confirmed. Turning to the magistrate and his 2 friends, he said that he could not allow such a group of men to board his small ship, and the corregidor nodded compliantly. Yet before Foster could give his crew the final signal to repulse an attack, he heard the beat of the battle drum from the Spanish ships below, and the unmistakable sound of their swords being unsheathed. The thud of the grappling irons and the roar of the Biscayans wrestling alongside the Primrose to board her by force drowned out his orders to his men. The corregidor and his merchants seized Foster with daggers drawn at his throat, and cried out above the shouts of the melee, "Yield yourself, for you are the king's prisoner!" Foster narrowed his eyes and bellowed back, "We are betrayed!" The crew of the Primrose had fortunately taken the defensive measures that her master had laid down for circumstances such as these. Within seconds, 5 calivers were fired through the grates from below decks at the Spaniards scuffling above. There were screams from those Biscayans who had legs blown off, and shouts to abandon their action from others. They could not know that it was the only gunpowder and shot that the Primrose had on board, but the few seconds of confusion the blast created was enough to turn the tide. Foster prized himself loose from his captors and gave the order to fight to the death. Many of the Biscayans fled back to the boarding vessels, fearing that they would be blown to smithereens, as several of their number had been seconds before. Others stood their ground. Hand-to-hand battle broke out, and the well-practised English drill of a skirmish at sea ensued. The English, knowing that if they were forced from the ship they would die 1,000 slow deaths, fought like demons possessed, with boar spears and lances, which whipped through 2 to 3 Spaniards at a stroke. Yet, despite the heavy carnage on the Spanish side, the outcome of the battle remained in doubt for a time. The only certainty to Foster and his men was that the deck of the Primrose was stained red with the blood of the Spaniards and Englishmen. Some Spaniards were flung overboard. Many of them begged for their lives, since they could not swim. The corregidor once again managed to put a dagger to Foster's throat, demanding that his men cease their fruitless opposition, or Foster would forfeit his own life. The master replied, "Such is the courage of the English nation in defence of their own lives that they would prefer to slay them," the Spanish. In the heat of the attack, no one had witnessed how Master Foster had freed himself from the corregidor's clutches, and Foster himself never told the tale. The fighting raged on for another half an hour, with many Spanish Biscayans butchered, flung overboard, or drowned before the English could claim victory. Amazingly, only one Englishman, John Tristram, had been killed. 6 other members of the crew were injured, but Foster thought they would survive their wounds. He had to presume that his 2 men, John Burrell and John Broadbank, who had delivered the last of the corn cargo, had been taken into custody ashore. While the master and his crew made ready to set sail, Foster was perplexed why the Biscayan merchants who had escaped in the pinnaces did not bring reinforcements. He could not understand, at the moment of his own victory, why no armed relief for the corregidor had come. While he decided what should be done with the unfortunates struggling for their lives in the bay, Foster looked out across the harbour for the first time since the assault. All the other Londoners had the King of Spain's flag flying high on their masts. The Spanish treachery was now clear. The English ships had been lured into Spanish harbours for Philip II to confiscate in a master piratical act and leave England helpless. As the Primrose tacked into the bay, Foster knew that he must reach England in all haste and warn the City of London merchants. He took one last glance down at the Biscayans bobbing upon the water as the Primrose's sails filled with the southwesterly, and spied the corregidor and his merchants. Foster quickly ordered the crew to fish the Spanish pirates out of the sea. Once safely away from the Spanish shoreline, Foster demanded that the corregidor and his men be brought to his cabin for questioning. The Spanish officials, who had been hale and hearty only 2 hours earlier, now stood trembling and drenched in their bare feet in Foster's quarters. The master ordered the corregidor to answer why he and his men had boarded the Primrose and the other English vessels in harbour, ships that had come in peace at the behest of their king, delivering much-needed corn and other sustenance to Spain. The magistrate replied that it was none of his doing, and that if Master Foster would allow someone to fetch his hose, which were hanging up to dry, the master could see with his very own eyes that he had a commission from the King of Spain himself to seize all ships from heretic countries. When the commission was brought back for Foster to read, he scanned the drenched document. While the ink had run somewhat, the words, "A great fleet was being prepared. An embargo against foreign shipping is to take place with immediate effect. You must seize all ships in harbour or attempting to come into harbour, and without exception those ships from Holland, Zealand, Easterland, Germany and England, and any other country not in service of the king, except those ships from France," remained clearly visible. The order had been signed by King Philip II himself in Barcelona a week before. Foster had the corregidor sent back to the hold with his 3 merchants, Francisco de Guevara, Pedro de Villasreale, and John de Corrali. The crew was ordered to treat their prisoners well, since they may well be worth a ransom. In fact, the corregidor had already offered Foster 500 crowns to set them free. The master knew they were worth far more than that to the City of London, and that the king's instructions alone would warrant special recognition from the Queen herself. As Foster knew full well, the commission from the King of Spain would be of the greatest interest undoubtedly to the Privy Council. Its discovery might even earn him a place in naval history. Part 1. The Desperate Quest for Security, November 1558 to November 1568. Chapter 1. The Lord's Doing, November 17th, 1558. The dominion of the sea, as it is the ancient and undoubted right of the Crown of England, so it is the best security of the land. The wooden walls of ships are the best walls of the kingdom. Thomas Coventry, 1st Baron Coventry, 1635. When Elizabeth Tudor inherited the kingdom from her half-sister Mary I in November 1558, England was on the brink of ruin. The feeling of despair among the nobles can only be imagined. Not only had the country been torn between the ultra-Protestant reign of Elizabeth's half-brother Edward VII, followed by the fanatically Catholic Mary, but the crown was now proffered to the daughter of the reviled Queen Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth, who had lived her life as an unwelcome reminder of the union of Henry VIII and her mother, would most assuredly have been burned at the stake by Mary without the intervention of the Queen's absentee husband, Philip II of Spain. If there was one thing Elizabeth Tudor understood intuitively, it was life on the edge. Personal security was a luxury of which she must have dreamed as a child and young woman, and barely dared to hope for when her sister was queen. Mary had kept her prisoner, removing the Lady Elizabeth from palace to palace to prevent the next heir to the throne from plotting against her. During Elizabeth's time locked away in the Tower of London, each day could have brought the royal command for her execution, yet each day the Queen hesitated. It was in the Tower that Elizabeth's lifelong devotion to another prisoner, Robert Dudley, blossomed. Dudley, too, knew life on the edge. His father and grandfather had been executed for high treason, and it looked highly likely that he would follow them to the scaffold for plotting to overthrow Queen Mary. Dudley's loyalty to Elizabeth had been absolute before their imprisonment, often to the detriment of his own security. After their time together in the Tower, Elizabeth could never doubt his loyalty again. It was the only sure thing in her vulnerable life. When Mary's latest phantom pregnancy in the spring of 1558 did not produce a child, it was obvious to King Philip, the Privy Council, and the court that the swelling in Mary's abdomen was a tumour and not the heir that the King and Queen had so desired. With only Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, remaining as a potential heir apparent, this left Philip in no doubt as to the course of action to be undertaken. Elizabeth must be set free and named as his wife's heir. If Mary, Queen of Scots, were to take the throne of England, she would have become Queen of Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and England. These titles and kingdoms would have been added to her title as Queen of France, since she had lived in the French court since the age of 5 and had married the Dauphin Francis earlier in the year. Although Catholic, Philip was not prepared to allow the teenagers Mary and Francis to become the powerful pawns to Francis's mother, Catherine de' Medici. At all cost, he must stop the French crown from trying to abscond with Elizabeth's throne. Besides, Philip could not promote Mary Stuart's claim to the English throne above his own, since he too had a direct claim through his mother, Isabel of Portugal, a descendant of John of Gaunt of Lancaster. No, Elizabeth was a far better alternative as heir presumptive for Philip, despite the fact that he had long known that she practised the Protestant rites in private. This may have been the most important act of religious tolerance and clemency in the history of his long rule. While Philip was agonizing over his deliberations and eventually paving the road for Elizabeth to take the crown, the English nobility, Protestant and Catholic alike, had already made up their minds. A mood of desperation had crept over the country. As the autumn of 1558 turned chillier in early November, the roads to Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, Elizabeth's childhood home, were gridlocked with those who had served her half-sister, as well as others who had been exiled from power. All of them were singular in their purpose, to serve the new queen and better their positions. For the power brokers, like William Cecil, who had served faithfully as Secretary of State for Mary and Philip, Elizabeth not only represented the only viable successor, but also a fiercely intelligent one with whom he could do business. Others had different viewpoints. Philip's ambassador, Count Ferrier, who had also made his way to Hatfield, wrote to the king on November the 10th that "she is a very vain and clever woman. She must have been thoroughly schooled in the manner in which her father conducted his affairs, and I am very much afraid that she will not be well disposed in matters of religion. There is not a heretic or traitor in all the kingdom who has not joyfully raised himself from the grave to come to her side. She is determined to be governed by no one." This was no news to Philip. During Elizabeth's imprisonment in the Tower, she had written to Mary that "I so well like this estate, spinsterhood, as I persuade myself there is not any kind of life comparable unto it. No, though I were offered to the greatest prince of all Europe, I would rather proceed of a maidenly shamefastedness than upon any certain determination. For Elizabeth, who had undergone so many wrongs and near rape at the hands of her uncle, the hapless Thomas Seymour, the future queen had learned all the brutal lessons required of a young handsome woman that were necessary in the art of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?